Over the course of the last few months, I've seen a lot of comments asking me to talk about some of the big what-ifs in The Walking Dead history. What if Shane had lived? What if Carl had lived? What if really anybody could live? What if they had stayed at the prison? And all these seem like popular questions, considering they're basically making a Walking Dead what-if game coming soon. So I was thinking about all the possible what-if questions I've heard over the years, but the biggest what-if I can think of when it comes to The Walking Dead is what if the show was on HBO instead of AMC. And this isn't just some super hypothetical question, because The Walking Dead was actually offered to HBO and they passed on it because they thought it would be too violent. Now, hang on a second. Too violent? Coming from the same network that produced shows like Game of Thrones, Boardwalk Empire, and The Sopranos, just to name a few? If The Walking Dead was too violent for HBO, how did it get released on a regular television channel like AMC? The obvious answer is the change in adaptation. The Walking Dead comics are notable for featuring much heavier themes than the show that came out on AMC, so this leads me to believe that HBO passed on the material because they were gonna adapt it very faithfully. And with The Last of Us being adapted very faithfully to its video game counterpart, I think that we would have gotten a comic-accurate Walking Dead show had it not been passed up in the first place. So in this video, I'm going to be asking the biggest what-if when it comes to The Walking Dead. What if the show was on HBO instead of AMC? I'll talk about some of the bigger moments in the comics, at least the ones I can talk about without getting this video demonetized. How different it would have been, and some of the stuff we would have never gotten that we did get with the AMC adaptation. So grab your comic books and log into your HBO Max account, and let's talk about The Walking Dead on HBO. So I think it's best that we start off by talking about what a typical HBO show looks like in comparison to what a typical AMC show looks like, but more specifically what this looked like around 2010 when the show was made. In 2010/2011, two of the biggest shows on HBO were Game of Thrones and Boardwalk Empire. Each of these shows had 10 episodes and 12 episodes respectively, while the first season of The Walking Dead only had 6 episodes. This was more to do with the studio testing the waters of the show before giving it the go-ahead for more episodes. Now let's look at the biggest show on AMC at 2010, and that was Breaking Bad. The first season of Breaking Bad had 7 episodes, again testing the waters with the audience before going into the full 13 episode and 16 episode future seasons. HBO automatically starts with the higher number of episodes, but even the higher number of episodes, the 10 and 12 episodes, aren't as big as the 13 or 16 episode seasons. While this might not sound like that big of a difference, 1 episode and 6 episodes, in terms of telling a story through these episodes, it's a pretty big difference. In HBO shows, there's no time for filler or bottle episodes. Bottle episodes are episodes that take place in one location with a limited number of cast and don't have that big of a budget. The AMC series, The Walking Dead, is notorious for having bottle episodes. And I'm not talking about one here and there, I'm talking about multiple every season after the first one. Even Breaking Bad has a few, the most notorious being The Fly, which is the lowest rated episode of the series. HBO doesn't have bottle episodes because they don't need to, and what that comes down to is budget. The budgets for all HBO shows, even the ones just starting out, are way higher than most other shows. The budget per episode for the second season of Game of Thrones was about $7 million per episode, while the budget for each episode of the second season of The Walking Dead was about $2.75 million. So the second season of The Walking Dead had a total budget of $35.75 million, while the second season of Game of Thrones had a budget of $70 million, and remember, this is off of less episodes. So if The Walking Dead was on HBO, this would automatically mean less filler episodes and a higher budget. That sounds great to me. Now let's talk about the writing. Having a higher budget doesn't always mean that the writing is better, but I'd say most of the time, especially when it comes to HBO, it does. I said most of the time, not every time. A big problem with The Walking Dead on AMC is the 1-8-9-16 problem. I've talked about this recently in my videos, but for those that aren't aware, The Walking Dead was notorious for only having major story beats or even events happen in the premiere, the mid-season finale, the mid-season premiere, and the season finale, aka 1, 8, 9, and 16. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this, but the majority shareholder for this was because of ratings. These episodes were usually the most watched, and it led most of the other episodes being bottle or filler episodes, so the main events could be shown in these episodes. And while I don't have any facts on this or anything, but the 2+2 of this situation means that because they had to save the major events for these episodes, the writing was compromised. They couldn't get right into the action that the pacing was calling for, so there would be a side episode showing what characters were up to during the events of the last few episodes, so everybody was where they needed to be for the action-packed episodes that progressed the story, meaning that a lot of times in AMC's The Walking Dead, we would get one viewpoint of a character per episode. With such a large cast and many storylines happening at once, this brought the pacing of the show to a snail's speed. And this was especially noticeable in seasons 7 and 8 of The Walking Dead, which many consider to be the worst of the show. I don't want to only compare The Walking Dead to Game of Thrones, but for this point, it's another easy comparison, so let's look at how Game of Thrones dealt with its major sprawling storylines and many different featured characters. There are hardly any episodes that solely feature in one location, and when they aren't bottle episodes, they're usually battle episodes. Blackwater, The Watchers on the Wall, The Long Night, these episodes are all in one place with one set of characters dealing with the major fallout from a specific storyline. Most of the times, these episodes even saw an increased budget, not a slashed one, because it's only a few characters and one location. Now let's talk about some other popular HBO shows, like The Last of Us. A 9-episode season, $10 million per episode, adapted from another medium. There are major events that happen in the premiere and the finale because all shows do that, but there are major events that progress these characters in each and every episode. Even the one that doesn't feature our two protagonists in a major way. There is no saving events for a specific major episode. There's the story that was mapped and planned, and the events happen according to what the pace of the show calls for. This was never really the case for The Walking Dead. Maybe early on in the series, particularly the 3rd season, where major events did happen spread throughout the season, the 1, 8, 9, 16 issue was present really from that season onward. So what am I really saying with all this? The Walking Dead had filler episodes because they needed to pad out a 16-episode season, but they didn't necessarily have enough content to fill all 16 episodes. So rather than make up new storylines to fill out those extra episodes, they reduced the story and focused on 1 or 2 characters, sent them out on a journey to retrieve supplies or gather something, and saved the story for the major episodes. HBO shows, no matter which one it is, never did that. The writing was never compromised to make sure specific events happened in specific episodes, to shock the audience in the mid-season finale so that way people would keep talking about the show as it went into break. So that sounds like another plus for HBO to me. The last thing I want to talk about is spin-offs. As it stands right now, The Walking Dead is the golden child of AMC. With 5 shows, 4 of them being spin-offs already out there in the world, and 2 more confirmed on the way, 2 more rumored, The Walking Dead stands up there with Law & Order as the series with the most spin-offs ever. In terms of HBO original shows, the only spin-off I could really find in my research was House of the Dragon. Let me know in the comments if there are any other HBO original shows that have spin-offs, because I couldn't find any. But throughout the entire history of the network, the only spin-off that I could find, and I guess was popular, is House of the Dragon. And while yes, there are a lot of rumored and planned Game of Thrones spin-offs in the works, who knows how many of these will actually see the light of day. So even if The Walking Dead had found the same success it did on AMC at HBO, there certainly wouldn't be 6 spin-offs out there already. I'd say 2 at maximum that is, and that's only if it achieved the same success, and there's no telling that it would've. So is this a positive or a negative? It's really up to you to decide. If you love all the Walking Dead spin-offs that we have, you might prefer the way that the universe is right now. If you stopped watching along the way, you probably would have preferred it on HBO. Well, Thrifty, you might be asking, you've only given positive points so far. How would The Walking Dead have not been as popular if it were on HBO? And thank you for asking that, because that leads me right into my next point. HBO has a very great track record when it comes to adapting material for a TV show. I said adapting, not creating new content. So for The Walking Dead, I'm almost positive that we would have seen a more accurate adaptation of the show. Now, I'm not going to go into every single difference that the show and the comics have. Just go and ask Hiroto's Mystery Shack how tall of a task that really is, and check out his videos while you're there. But what I will say is that the characters we know and love from the show on AMC would be very different. You guys remember the Governor? One of, if not the best villain in the whole show? Yeah, well, the first time that he meets Rick, he chops his hand off. Imagine a very prominent character in your show losing a hand very early on in the grand scheme of things and having to work around that. Well, they did that in Game of Thrones, so they probably do that here too. And the Governor is much more brutal and sadistic in the comics. He wouldn't be the charming Philip Blake, that's for sure, and that's really all I can say on that matter. The Walking Dead is a much more brutal and R-rated world in the comics. Maybe you guys have seen the alternate takes of Negan's introduction where he uses the dreaded F-word a bunch. Well, in the comics, that's really Negan's word. Whenever there was an F-bomb in the show, it would either be cut out and replaced with a different word, or it would make headlines because they said the F-word in a show where you can literally show people getting brutally murdered and mutilated, but the F-word, that's just too far now, come on. HBO doesn't have these limitations on language or, of course, nudity. And this would open up avenues for stories from the comics that involved nudity, and not in a good way, and that's all I can really say on that matter. Characters would be handled entirely differently, and I'll touch on that in just a few minutes, but characters like Carl would have seen a drastically different character arc, leaning more into the horror of what it would be like for a child to grow up in the apocalypse, and how that would affect you as a person. And yeah, they touched on that in the AMC show, but not with a prominent character like Carl. A lot of the things that people really love, like the Rick and Michonne pairing, wouldn't come to be because in the comics, Rick actually ends up with Andrea, not Michonne. There's a lot of these big decisions that people have grown to love coming from the AMC show that are entirely absent in the comics, but of course, it's also vice versa. It was huge and depressing news that Andrew Lincoln was leaving the show in the 9th season, especially because Rick was going to play such a pivotal role in the coming war against the Whisperers and eventually the Commonwealth. While there's no saying the actor for Rick would have stayed on for the long haul, it's entirely possible he would have, whoever he is, because if the show was on HBO, it might have not even been Andrew Lincoln. So while yes, it's not positive, it's probable that this comic-accurate version of the show on HBO, Rick would have been around for the long haul of the show, and we would have seen him till the very end of the series, not being picked up by a helicopter and away from his friends and family for 15 years. This is really only scratching the surface for everybody who's read the comics. I'm sure there are a lot of points that you're thinking of in your head right now, and for people who haven't read the comics, there are dozens, if not hundreds more options I could talk about right now, but the point is, the AMC show was, at times, faithful to the comics, but most of the time it was not so faithful. Now, is this a bad thing? Yes and no. It's easy to say that an HBO version would have been better because of all the stuff that the AMC version left out of the comics, but what about all the stuff the AMC version got right? So many people are very quick to write off the AMC version of the show, especially in recent years. Most of the comments I see on any article about The Walking Dead on any website are all about how they can't believe the show is still on, the series is dead, nobody watches anymore, I stopped watching at point X, Y, and Z. But the point is that you did watch it for many seasons for a lot of you, so there were things about the show that you did like, especially in those early seasons, and a lot of the stuff that you did like might not have ever been in a hypothetical HBO version. Let's talk about a character that everybody loves or loves to hate, and that's Shane. To this day, Shane is one of the most complex characters in the entire franchise. Some people think he was ahead of the curve, some people think he was an irredeemable jerk, but one way or another, everybody has a pretty strong opinion of Shane. Jon Bernthal's performance is incredible and set him up to be the star that he is today. But if this were a comic-accurate adaptation, regardless of if Shane was still betrayed by Bernthal or not, he would not be remembered as a layered and complex character because Shane gets killed at the end of Volume 1 in the comics. Just about everybody I've ever talked to likes TV Shane better than comic book Shane, and of course now that I've said that, somebody in the comments is going to tell me otherwise. There are plenty of character arcs from the show that are entirely different from their comic book counterparts, like Carol, who dies in the prison arc in the comic book, but goes on to be one of the best female written characters in the history of TV shows. That might be an unpopular opinion, but you can't deny that Carol's character arc from abused housewife to complete and total badass is not significant to the show. A lot of people stopped watching the show when Glenn died because they liked him so much, but that was going to happen anyway because that's what happened in the comics, but you might not have cared as much as you did because Glenn's role in the comics is not nearly as big as it is in the show. Everyone really liked Steven Yeun and his performance as Glenn, so we became incredibly attached to him and the writers gave him a more prominent role, but that might not have happened in this comic-accurate HBO adaptation. There are some very iconic weapons and items in the show, like Lucille and Michonne's katana, and both of those are present in the comics, but you know what isn't? Rick's famous Colt Python revolver. This was something that surprised me when I read the comics because it's just so attached to Rick and eventually the Grimes family, right along with the cowboy hat. When Rick left the show, his revolver was passed down to Judith, which might be a point to the HBO side of things because Judith's role was really supposed to be Carl's role, but anyways, they made it a point to show him have one last shot with his Colt Python in his final episode because it was just that important to Rick's character. In Season 7, the gun was symbolic to show us how Rick was ready to fight Negan now, and all of this is entirely made up for the show. There's not only character arcs and items that are unique to the show, but entire storylines as well. The big one that comes to my mind is Terminus, which took elements of a storyline from the comics, but revamped it and made it bigger and better in every possible way. The iconic barn scene is original to the show, and while it might have been a poor decision in retrospect because of how big Sophia's character went on to be in the future of the comics, the barn scene is still one of the most iconic scenes, and Pretty Much Dead Already is one of the best episodes of the show. But a huge factor that people might not consider when talking about how AMC handled things versus how HBO could have is the character of Daryl Dixon. Daryl is, to this day, the most popular character in The Walking Dead. He's the one that sells the most merch, he's the one that everybody looks up the most, he's the one getting a spin-off show with his name in the title, he's the one who took over for Rick when he departed the show. This monumental character in this universe is not in the comics. A lot of you know this, but for those that didn't know that, I imagine you're pretty surprised. Daryl was introduced in the 3rd episode of the show as Merle's brother, a new role in the show, and by the 3rd season, he was the most popular character by a wide margin. Yes, even more popular than Rick Grimes. So could HBO have made a better version of the show? Possibly, but it wouldn't have Daryl Dixon in it. I could go on and on talking about the differences of the comics and the show and what could have happened versus what did happen, but that's not the point of this video. HBO has a supreme track record, especially when it comes to adaptations. Could they have made a fantastic TV show that stayed true to the comics and have it go on to be as highly regarded as it is today, if not more so? Yes, they absolutely could have. And I bet a few years ago, the HBO executives were really kicking themselves for passing on the show. But if you're a fan of my content and of The Walking Dead still, you could drive yourself crazy about the what ifs for this entire universe. If you're not a fan of the show and this is the first video of mine you've ever seen, then maybe you still watch The Walking Dead, or most likely you dropped off somewhere along the way. But along that way, there were reasons that you watched the show, reasons that differed from what happened in the comics. Maybe it was something I mentioned in this video, or maybe it was something else entirely, or maybe you hated Rick's Colt Python, didn't care for Glenn, and only cared about the stuff from the comics. But I have a feeling that's probably not the case. AMC's The Walking Dead had a lot of slip-ups over the past decade. There were mistakes that led to people leaving the show, both viewers and cast members, and not every episode was as great as it could have been when it comes to pacing or even budget, but I don't think that the show deserves anywhere near the amount of hate that it receives. The show got a lot of things right, and when they got it right, they really got it right. Everyone watching this video has at least one fond memory of watching the show. Maybe it was watching it with friends and family, binging it on Netflix after you came home from work, making the show feel comforting and exciting, rooting for the characters that you liked, booing the characters that you hated, but something on this journey led you to keep watching or watch for as long as you did, and it doesn't matter how many mistakes the show made or mishaps it had over the years, there's always some good to take away from AMC's adaptation. That's what I'm really trying to say. So as good as HBO is, as good as the comics are, as bad as some of the seasons or episodes were of the actual show, this universe still has a lot of fans, and it's nowhere near dead despite what any comments on any website article might say, and it's been around this long for a reason, because AMC did a fantastic job with this series. It's the main reason I started making content on The Walking Dead. I might not have loved all of it, I still don't, but every video essay I could find was about the decline of the show and how bad it is now, and I wanted to try and make some positive content surrounding the show. Despite all the negativity surrounding the universe right now, I've seen many people who still enjoy this series. Still have watch parties, still watch it when you get home from work, root for your favorite characters, boo the ones you don't like, and overall enjoy what AMC has done with this universe. And if you're still watching this, then the odds are you probably enjoyed the show for what it was at some point too. And with 2 upcoming spin-offs and more on the way, there's no better time to catch up with everything that's happened, and you should, because this franchise isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and I, for one, couldn't be more excited for what's coming. But in a few years, if HBO, wants to make a comic accurate adaptation, I'd be all for it.
Yeah.